Now, with both parties making promises that their hip pockets might not be able to cash, let's get some fiscal honesty from a man who's been checking the budget bottom line for decades. Joining us from Canberra is Chris Richardson from Deloitte Access Economics. Is decades too long, Chris?
No, there's been a number of them, sadly.
I've watched you do it for decades as well, mate. Let's start off with, I think, an issue that people care about but they don't understand is how bad is our public debt situation, Chris?
Look, if you compare it to a bunch of nations we usually compare ourselves to, to debts and deficits in the US or in Europe or the UK or Japan, Australia's a standout. We don't have much. Then again, that's not the right standard for us. We've been slipstreaming a China boom for a decade. We should have had much stronger public finances, a much stronger performance under governments of both stripes than we have achieved. We should have done better.
Yeah, OK. So there's been a lot of talk recently from people like you and me about the worry is the structural deficit. How worried should we be about that? And maybe do a decent job explaining what the structural deficit is for the normal people watching this show.
Sure. Look, the economy bounces around. It has good times, bad times. Economists try to take that out and they say, where would the budget be if the economy were operating at trend levels of activity, not trend growth, trend levels of activity. The big thing that's different today than you would expect in an ordinary economy, if you like, and showed up in Treasury figuring around this structural budget deficit and the new Parliamentary Budget Office doing the same. They said that if you look forward, chances are that coal and iron ore prices will be lower than today, that miners around the world will dig deeper, those prices will go lower as a result of that, and other things equal, that will bring down tax receipts. They said if you allow from that, then instead of the small surplus that the official figures point to in a few years' time, you'd actually have a reasonably solid deficit in the years ahead.
And so, in a sense, it's not really a big surprise that we've got a structural deficit brewing because money was actually spent during the GFC, wasn't it, on school halls, the BATS program, the money that was just sent out to Australians, all that sort of stuff was just earmarked spending. And now, do we add in the education, the Gonski program, the National Disability Scheme? These are all promises to spend that don't go away. And that's the part that makes up structural deficit, isn't it, Chris?
Oh, look, very true. And arguably our spending issues go back a decade, big increases in family benefits and the like when the economy was strong and the budget was even stronger still. Both sides did it. Both sides took a temporary boom and assumed it would be permanent. Same mistake we've made throughout Australia's history. The only difference, this was a bigger boom and we made even bigger promises. And across the last 3 months, the months where Treasury's caught up with that and said, well, look, the amount of money in the budget bucket is smaller than we thought, that, Treasury's been revising down that. That's been the same time where we've seen both sides of politics signing on to, big spending. Yes, disability care, yes, schools, submarines in Adelaide. And then, of course, now both sides during the election campaign are making different promises, but they are still promising stuff that we can't afford. OK, so let's start with the government costings first up, because they've come from Treasury. Do you trust government costings? I come from Treasury too, or at least in a grand sense. You cut me and I still bleed Treasury. So look, I do believe that there's two sets of figures, if you like, that come out from Treasury. One is the broad picture, where is the budget headed? And they've had trouble with that over the last decade. We do similar numbers.
Since you left, Chris, isn't it? Since you left, they've had trouble, haven't they?
I would love to say that. There may have been a small gap in between. And the real key is, you see, China, good news, bad news, iron ore prices, coal prices, those are the sorts of things that drive budgets these days. And those are the sorts of things that aren't easy to forecast. Treasury's getting them wrong. But costings are different. It sort of says, well, what if you move this policy that way, that tax, that type of spending. Ordinarily, provided the policies aren't too far out of the ordinary, Treasury costings aren't too bad.
Okay, so Joe Hockey said last week, the reason why I'm not going to give you costings now is, well, we haven't announced all our policies, but once the policies are out, then you can do the costings. He's using the PBO, was it the Public Budgetary Office?
Parliamentary Budget Office,
That's
a
right.
great innovation.
PBO. All right, so is that a fair call? If you haven't, let's imagine they don't want to actually tell the government all their policies. Until you actually put them on the table, you can't really effectively cost them, can you?
Look, that's very true. All oppositions use some version of that story. They don't like to lay their costings out because that means laying their policies out, and they want to keep as many of them secret, you know, to be revealing them at the time they'd like. It is absolutely classic in Australia. That's what all oppositions do. But it does in some ways make the debate harder. You know, people would like to know, well, what is the government promising? What is the opposition promising?
Yeah. All right. An important part of the story, and I know you have a view on this, is the China story. Like, remember about 5 years ago, everyone wanted to talk about the super cycle. Now, it didn't end up being a super cycle, but it could kick off again, couldn't it?
Look, it could, but people always misunderstood the super cycle. Economics doesn't give you super cycles in prices. You know, it never had. There has never been a permanent boom in profit margins in anything. But the rise of China and after that India and after that other parts of the world will be a super cycle in commodity demand. May not be quite as spectacular as we've seen in the last decade. There were, you know, some one-off things that happened in China that really turbocharged commodity demand. But broadly, you know, a whole bunch of the world is having an industrial revolution. They will get more commodity hungry. That'll be a super cycle. But the prices that Australia gets for it, that's what, you know, that'll return to something rather more sensible. And that, you know, we're already seeing some pain in the economy from that. But it's the budget that was always the biggest beneficiary when those prices went up, and what has hurt the most is those prices have lost some steam.
Okay, let's now focus on the A dollar, because you might have heard George before saying it's important for industrial stocks. PIMCO this week thinks it's going down to the low 80s. I've had other people saying because they believe China's going to actually surprise on the high side, it could go up into the high 90s again. What's your view?
Look, for a long time we've said that by 2017 or so, the Australian dollar would be back to US 80 cents. And it's funny, you know, when we were saying that in the last year, at times, you know, the dollar was $1.08 or $1.05, and there was a big pushback from people. That, you know, they were saying, no, that's silly. Now they're saying, well, you know, couldn't it come earlier than that? The answer is yes, you know, it could come earlier. But it had to come down, and that's what people don't understand. Commodity prices always had to come down. You know, it only took the miners to dig deeper for those prices to come down, and a lot more of that's in the pipeline. So that will, other things equal, drag the dollar down over time. And so will, you know, we're talking about what's happening in the US Fed and its impact on the market today. At some stage, interest rates go up in the US, they go up in the UK and Europe and so on, and other things equal, that removes support for the Australian dollar too. You can argue the timing, but over time it will come down.
Okay, Chris, one last area, and that is interest rates. Now, once upon a time, where they are now, people would have called them emergency levels. But is it really emergency levels? Inflation seems really low. We're not spending. It's kind of like an abnormal time. So isn't it sort of normal to have abnormal rates when things are abnormal?
Well, look, Australia's economy is not in an emergency. You know, this isn't a global financial crisis. You know, sure, we're travelling slowly. But the Reserve Bank has to have rates low because of the construction cliff. Those big mega mining projects, they're winding down. To fill that gap in the economy, they need to get bits of the interest rate sensitive bits of the economy moving. That means retailers, that means housing, construction. So the point is, you know, whether or not the Reserve Bank cuts rates again, it will have to keep them low for a couple of years.
Yeah, so, and this is a related area. I know you've always had strength in housing. Do you worry about a housing bubble? A lot of the alarmists from overseas, oh, gee, Australia's heading for alarmist bubbles. But I've seen some recent figures of what, say, Sydney house prices have done on a 10-year and 5-year basis. I think 5 years up about 4.2% per annum, and on a 10-year basis up about 2.5% per annum. Is it a housing bubble waiting to happen here?
If you take a pretty long-term view and you look at some basic indicators, housing in Australia isn't overpriced. It has been. You know, a decade ago it was quite notably overpriced. Having said that, we've gone 22 years without a recession. You know, we don't see a recession coming in the next 12 months or so, but at some stage it will happen. Housing's been a big beneficiary of the good times. It'll see a shakeout when a recession eventually hits. You know, not from bubble levels, but yes, it'll have its own correction.
Chris, thanks for joining us on the program.
Thanks, Peter.